Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the Operations Coordinator for CFAL York. I would like to officially open the 15th session of the Climate Change Emergencies and Cultural Heritage Speaker Series, which is being presented in partnership with Heritage Ottawa and World Heritage Catalysis. I would like to begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Tkaronto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event and our participants may be joining from various locations, I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our speaker, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Nikki Dhaliwal. Nikki Dhaliwal is a dedicated emergency and disaster management professional with extensive experience in climate resiliency, mitigation, and risk management across federal, provincial, and municipal levels. Currently, she works at Emergency Management Ontario as a training and exercise developer, working with Ontario municipalities and ministries to execute multi-year climate resiliency projects. Nikki credits her international work with refugees in Austria, South Korea, and Spain with fueling her passion for emergency management and interest in safeguarding cultural heritage in the face of climate change. Nikki, thank you very much for moderating today's session. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Francisco, and thank you everyone for having me today. I want to extend thanks to Professor Asghari and Tarian for having me, as well as our speaker, who I'll introduce shortly. Before I do, I'll get into a bit of housekeeping. So the chat can be used for general introductions and commentary you may have during the presentation. And we will have a Q&A opportunity at the end of the session. You can ask questions through the Q&A function there, or if you'd like to ask your questions directly to Dr. Shetabi, you can do so by raising your hand and we'll call on you to ask those questions orally. As for my background, yeah, Francisco got into it very well. My professional focus is emergency management, but during my time working internationally, I really got to witness firsthand how climate change can displace people and saw the profound importance that cultural heritage holds for individuals and communities. So it was that experience that really sparked my passion for exploring the intersection of disaster management and cultural heritage preservation. And that's why I'm so thankful to be a part of this today and with everyone here, because I know history must hold a great significance for anyone who wants to participate or be involved in one of these sessions. So again, yeah, the commentary or the chat can be used for general discussions or anything you might want to say. But if you have questions, use the Q&A option, or you can ask the questions directly at the end of the session. So let's get right to it. Thank you for joining us, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Linda Shetabi. She's a powerhouse in the field of heritage conservation and environmental sustainability. Dr. Shetabi is a lecturer and director of the MSc Conservation Program at the University of Hong Kong's Division of Landscape Architecture. There, her research focuses on the intersection of climate change, sustainable development, and the protection of cultural heritage. Her wider research includes the role of heritage conservation in achieving the UN 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development and its contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. She also has the research in digitizing heritage at risk. She's a co-author of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, Heritage, and the Sustainable Development Goals. As a member of ICMOS, which I know has an acronym, but I'm always confused how to pronounce it. She contributes to the annual policy recommendations of the NGO Major Group for the UN High-Level Political Forum and collaborates with various NGOs on streamlining conservation actions with the goals of sustainable development. Beyond her academic work, Dr. Shetabi serves as an advisor on sustainable development and heritage conservation policies and practices, And in today's session, she'll share her expertise on the complexities of implementing sustainable development and heritage conservation policies in the face of climate change. So without further ado, I'll introduce Linda Shetabi, Dr. Linda Shetabi. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you for a very lovely introduction. A little bit taken aback, but thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be invited to share some of the issues that I grapple with every day. I am going to share my screen. All right. Right. Hopefully everybody can see my screen, right? Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me to this talk. But before I start, I would like to take a moment to remember all of those who have lost their lives, loved ones, livelihoods, heritage, and the natural and cultural richness of their hometowns and countries due to ongoing wars and conflict across the world. I hope that one day we can all live in peace. When Professor Atorian first asked me if I was interested to participate in this series, my immediate reaction was yes. But then I thought, how am I going to narrow this down to just 40 minutes? So for the reasons of, shortening the talk, I will only focus on built heritage, and I'll try to break it down into how international policy frameworks shape national policy and how that's interpreted and implemented through the planning policy, and what are some of the issues that arise in the adaptive reuse of historic buildings in terms of sustainability. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to look at the UK, and I'm going to bring some references from before the 2020 COVID pandemic. Now, sustainable development, what does it really mean? It's quite obvious that for now, we can't live outside of planet Earth. For now, we need to make sure that we live in peace and harmony with our existing ecosystems. In my view, sustainable development depends entirely on the well-being of our ecosystems, and our actions to promote social inclusion and economic prosperity cannot come at the expense of destroying our planet. In the past few decades that I've been involved in conservation and sustainability, and especially more recently as I've been analyzing policy, I've grown a little frustrated with how far we still have to go in order to fulfill our promise of sustainability. It seems that we are still fighting some of the same battles, but we have not yet made sufficient headway to prevent the further destruction of our cultural and natural assets. In terms of national and international policy, we've become much more focused on sustainability than the early days of the Brundtland Report. And each decade has brought much better understanding, and with it, more nuanced policy debates. But in terms of effective policy, we still have a long way to go. Some of this ineffectiveness, of course, is due to the complex nature of policymaking, which, in the absence of war and pandemics, has to take into account issues of national capacity, political feasibility, public buy-in, and costs. On the international side, we continue to grapple with the historic legacies of unequal power relations and their long-term consequences. Policy alignment between countries of different political persuasions and national aspirations, modern diplomacy, and reaching a consensus when conditions, priorities, and values are not the same. One can argue that this is true about any policy. But when we look at values in public policy, in heritage conservation and in sustainable development, there are interesting synergies that should technically create more favorable alignments in terms of policy goals and objectives. Values are decisive in our private and public lives, influencing everything from everyday consumption choices to political leanings. In public policy, values are the informing principle of collective action. In heritage, values justify what is selected as heritage and how it's cared for. Thus, it's central to its inception and management. And I doubt anyone would argue on the value of our natural ecosystems, because without that, our survival on this planet would be impossible. So heritage conservation and sustainable development both value the stewardship of our cultural and natural resources for the enjoyment and benefit of present and future generations. Implied in this idea of stewardship is long-term thinking and planning that protects both our cultural assets and our natural resources. And in a perfect world, they shouldn't really be a conflict. One could argue that they are complementary. The adaptive reuse of built heritage is a form of recycling that reduces the production of waste and the consumption of new resources. And we've known this for many decades, and we have many publications and research to support these claims. So why is it that in implementation of policy do we still have a disconnect between rhetoric, research, and practice? Today's news on the state of our planet isn't good. We're facing global temperature crisis. Sea levels are rising, and these have real life impacts on lives and on heritage. Extreme weather patterns are destroying our heritage, our livelihoods across the world, and no nation is immune from these impacts. They cost money, but more importantly, it is the irreplaceable loss of lives and natural and cultural resources that have a heavy burden on us and our planet. So let's take a look at policy to see what are some of the issues that we have to grapple with. To determine whether policy has been effective in delivering our desired outcomes, ideally, it would have gone through several cycles of policy design, development, and implementation, where we've had a chance to reflect on the challenges of implementation and consider options for achieving our policy objectives. For that reason, it would be helpful to look at a country that, like the United Kingdom, has had a long history of developing policy for conservation and for sustainable development to understand some of the challenges that exist in both protecting heritage assets and achieving sustainability. This not only helps with the further refinement of existing policy, but it also provides valuable lessons for other countries who are still at the early stages of policy development. I currently live in Hong Kong, and this is particularly true for places like Hong Kong, where the first policy for the protection of heritage was introduced in 1976. And by then, many of the early historic buildings had already been demolished. In the UK, the legislative framework for the protection of built heritage began with the passage of the Ancient Monuments Protection Act of 1882. And since then, it has gone through numerous iterations to determine what is protected. And then eventually, this informs how planet policy is developed to guide the decision-making process where historic buildings and conservation areas are concerned. In terms of sustainable development, the UK was also one of the first nations to embrace sustainable development. After the 1992 UN Rio Declaration on Environment and Development and the Agenda 21 Action Plan, the UK was one of the first UN member states to prepare national strategies for sustainability that included criteria and indicators to measure progress. And here is where the details of measuring progress makes the process of conserving heritage and attaining sustainability a bit of a challenge. Because to develop indicators, we have to determine the key areas that need to be monitored and measured. And for that monitoring and measuring, we need to have sufficient resources and training and personnel that can conduct and collect that data, conduct that research and collect that data. So let's look at some of these indicators to see how this breaks down in the planning process. Let's look at Sustainable Development Goal 11, which is an often cited SDG when it comes to heritage. In SDG 11, which is about sustainable cities and communities, some of the targets that have been identified to help shape national policy are safe and affordable housing, affordable and sustainable transport systems, inclusive and sustainable urbanization. It's meant to protect the world's cultural and natural heritage within our communities and to reduce the adverse effects of natural disasters. All of the things that we deal with on a daily basis in an urban setting. Now, how does this manifest in practice and during the implementation of planning policy? I'm going to look at two listed historic buildings in Glasgow, Scotland. These two buildings were converted to housing. Now I have to provide a little bit of a background for those who are not from the UK on some of the details of planning in the UK. So first of all, listed buildings are those that have special architectural or historic interest, and they enjoy legal protection against demolition. In the UK, in the planning system, there's a presumption in favor of retaining all listed buildings, and any activity that may impact the significance requires planning permission. This is very important because, for instance, in a place like Hong Kong, listed buildings do not enjoy this kind of protection. You can knock them down. Now, the statutory framework for spatial development in the UK, the UK is made up of 4 nations, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And these nations have their own planning policy, but generally, when it comes to sustainability, they all follow UK's model. So when it deals with international instruments, it's all considered one country, and every nation aligns their policy with that. And so there's a national policy framework. Now, depending on which nation, the name is a little different, but they're all basically the same. And then we have the planning practice guidance, or the Scottish planning policy, and that determines how objectives of the national planning framework is developed. On top of all of these, we have policies and guidance on architecture and design, and then we have circulars that contain policy on the implementation of legislation and procedure. And so the planning system determines where and how development and sites are developed. And a planning permission is required for all new development, changes in buildings and land use, and changes to listed buildings. And this is where we are able to see how the implementation of planning policy impacts heritage conservation and how heritage conservation policy intersects with sustainability. In the conversion process of historic buildings, not only are the impacts on the historic fabric evaluated, but buildings also have to comply with building standards. Building standards is where we can measure some of the sustainability requirements in terms of energy, waste, and things like that. So policies and guidelines are regularly updated almost every couple of years, if not more, to guide changes in the built environment. And the implementation, of course, is reviewed both by national bodies, but also by other affiliations that sort of monitor and report back to the government, including academia. Now, the two buildings that we're going to look at are both schools. Why? Because I really wanted to look at buildings that were robust. And in Scotland, the passage of the Education Act of the 1872 established school boards that were responsible for the construction and running of local schools. This resulted in a construction campaign, and the School Board of Glasgow and Govan together delivered 107 new schools between 1873 and 1919. Now, the early architects that they selected were architects who knew how to design schools, and they were mostly prominent and famous architects. Now, these school buildings reflected the nation's aspiration for modern, civilized, and progressive social order that valued its human resources. Today, many of those buildings are listed, and some of them are still being used as schools. So these buildings were built to last, they are robust, and they used good materials and construction techniques for them to still be functioning as a school. But in heritage, finance plays a pivotal role in almost all aspects. And this influence sometimes starts even before a heritage asset is listed as culturally significant. In the 1960s, local authorities like Glasgow City Council used mortgages to secure loans and borrow from the Public Works Loan Board to pay for various expenses, including the upkeep and maintenance of school buildings. Due to a variety of historic reasons, capital expenditure controls and strategies changed through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. The upshot of all of these policy changes was that in those 4 decades, many of these historic schools cut back on maintenance as a cost-cutting strategy. Buildings were not regularly maintained, and because of demographic changes, some of these school buildings were decommissioned. Between decommissioning and deferred maintenance, the condition of these listed buildings began to deteriorate. Now, the local government was left with a number of listed buildings that are decommissioned. They're not in great condition, and so they can't be really leased out for other uses. And these become a financial liability. And at a time when all governments are grappling with expenses and many other priorities like providing education, healthcare, housing, and things like that. What are they to do with all of these decommissioned mothballed buildings? There's a housing shortage in the UK. So the conversion of a decommissioned listed school into housing makes perfect sense. So in the case of the buildings that we're going to look at, this one was a B-listed school. It means that it wasn't the very best example, but it's a pretty good example of the historic buildings of its time. It has character-defining elements, and this particular one was built in the 1930s, modified in the 60s, and decommissioned in 2012. 2 years later, the developer of the social housing starts discussions with the planning authority, and eventually in 2016, the conversion process starts. Once the architects get onto the site, they determine that there is much more damage to the building that was originally anticipated. So when the building was decommissioned, nobody's going to take care of it. In some cases, they board up the windows, but in some cases, sometimes the windows are not boarded up. So there's water ingress, there is pigeons going in. So there's all sorts of other environmental damage happening to the building while the building is sitting vacant. Often in these cases, you have lead theft, or you have other pieces of the building that are financially viable taken and stripped off the building, which also then further deteriorates the building. So by the time the architects get into site, this building has had significant damage. Because of that, they're able to save most of the exterior envelope, but the interior is completely gutted. The roof has to be rebuilt, and the chimney has to be dismantled and reassembled again. Why? Because the chimney is considered a character-defining element. In this particular process, the windows were determined to be character-defining elements. That means that it's rather difficult to change them. But this was developed for social housing for the elderly. And so, according to the requirements for social housing, and because the clients are elderly, they need to be able to open and close the windows easily. The historic windows that were on this building were very difficult to manage for an elderly person. So the architect wanted to change it, both for environmental reasons, because it was very drafty. They wanted to put double glazing, and also because of operations. But the local planning authority said, no, you can't do that because it's a character-defining element. So here, environmental sustainability, where you're supposed to make the building more tight and make it more energy efficient, is coming at odds with historic building requirements. Anyway, long story short, they are able to change all the windows, but they have to special order it, and it's very expensive, and blah, blah, blah. Along the same lines, they also have to do some other things, which means that all the units in this building need to be bigger to accommodate people with various abilities. That also means that per square footage, they can carve out fewer units. Overall, in terms of affordability, the project costs a lot more for the developer, while the inhabitants enjoy an affordable house. Project itself was not very affordable, and after this particular developer decided not to use listed buildings for their future projects, no matter how cheap they get the land. The units were accessible and designed for the elderly, so the interior and the exterior spaces are inclusive. for people of a variety of abilities. However, this particular site was sort of it's north of Glasgow. It's a little further than city center, and it's in a little bit of a more deprived neighborhood. And generally, when the economic situation is bad, that impacts public transportation. So there is always this worry that if the economy tanks, then access to public transport is also going to be more difficult, and therefore accessibility to city center and other places for this particular project will also be impacted. In terms of heritage, well, we've lost quite a lot of significant historic fabric, but all the new developments that were put into the playground and the external fabric was maintained. What was demolished was either reused on the site for repairs and restoration, or it was pulverized and used on site in areas where they needed coverage. Solar panels were not allowed because it's a listed building. So they can't put solar panels on areas that are visible from the outside. So that means that in terms of implementing so-called green strategies, there are also limitations. But how sustainable are solar panels? Solar panels' lifespan is about 20 years. Of course, newer technology will improve the output, but the process of producing the solar panels and then discarding them for newer versions doesn't really fit into a sustainable consumption. So what are we really doing when we put individuals, groups of solar panels on single projects? Are we really kicking the bucket of sustainability 20 years down the road? And in terms of SDG 12, are we really being responsible with our consumption? Now, the school that I just showed you had a design and access statement that emphasized sustainability in terms of embodied carbon, the reuse of the building, the social value. But for this one, which is a C-listed building, and it was located in a more desirable neighborhood, these kinds of requirements were not mentioned when the project was proposed to the planning authorities. There was no mention of sustainability, no mention of energy efficiency, or the environmental merits of retaining the historic fabric. When I asked why wasn't sustainability statement a requirement, I was told that I don't think it was required. I mean, we work in a lot of residential areas. Some local authorities have their own policy of sustainability and some don't. As far as I know, Glasgow either doesn't have a policy to consider or it's not required to meet standards. This isn't entirely true, but this is often a problem you face in that information is not well circulated. And actually, according to the latest research of the Royal Institute of Surveyors, in the UK, there is a problem in the planning department in retaining capacity and training people. They have difficulty with having enough personnel that know all the standards and have the time and ability to process everything. So there's a little bit of a crisis there also in terms of capacity in the planning authorities across the UK. And when we talked a little bit more about this particular building, I was told that, well, hey, the building has an atrium, the atrium's windows open. So back in 1904, there was some sustainability thought put into this, and we are saving that atrium. Anyway, then we come to the listing of this building. This building was a C-listed building. That means that there are many examples of this building available, or this building has gone through many changes throughout the course of its life. Actually, this building was much more ornate and much more architecturally significant. It was grander, it was designed by an important architect, it sat very prominently in a quite central location, and more importantly, this is the only decommissioned listed school building that had an intact swimming pool and janitor's house. And the swimming pool had all of its historic fabric almost 90% intact. And in the description of this building, all of these details were described in great detail. However, in the planning process, it is at the planner's discretion on how they deal with these architectural details. Sometimes the Historic Environment Scotland that is in charge of caring for Scotland's heritage assets and also educating people on the heritage assets. Sometimes on their website for these listed buildings, there's a lot of explanation and it details out everything, and sometimes it isn't. And in some places, the planning officer knows the building very well and identifies certain areas of the building that the planner determines as significant, and therefore the developer has to take that into consideration when they're doing their development. And it's completely different from what's listed on the Historic Environment Scotland's platform for this listed building. And sometimes on that platform, there's a lot of information, but the planning officer determines that only certain things are important. And in this case, only certain things were important. So at the beginning, the janitor's house and the pool were not included in the development, but in order to develop it, they had to make changes to a particular building. That building had a party wall with the janitor's house. That causes insurance problems. They couldn't get a mortgage. So eventually, the pool and the janitor's house was included in the development on the condition that they be demolished. And so in this case, we had significant historic fabric loss. Not only historic fabric, but really sort of irreplaceable historic fabric. But for this to be feasible as a private luxury housing, the developer needed to make money and maximize the space. Now, because this is being developed as private housing, it doesn't need to meet the stringent requirements of public housing or social housing, and therefore the units can be smaller. So in these cases, the waste for this particular building, some of the demolition items that were salvaged were shipped to China. The other ones were either pulverized on site or sent to landfill. And so you think, well, what about waste? What about responsible consumption? There's a difficulty with salvaging waste, and that is because there's an impression that salvaged building materials may not be structurally sound. You can't insure it. If you can't insure it, it might impact the insurance of the whole development, and then you can't get mortgage. So sometimes salvage materials if they are usable, they have more of an economic and a financial value rather than an environmental value. So this takes us to the next big issue of emissions. The building and the construction industry is one of the biggest emitters of carbon. In the UK, around 40% of carbon emissions are linked to the built environment. This is from construction to operation, maintenance, and all of these things. Heating, cooling, and lighting, which is the operations of the building, accounts for 28% of global emissions, with the remaining 11 attributed to embodied carbon. Research shows that in the UK, if it is to reach its current 2050 net zero targets, it needs to look at its construction sector very carefully because currently it is going to fall short. With that in mind, the UK is still continuing to go on with constructions of material that are emissions heavy. These are material like steel and cement, which globally account for 50% of our carbon emissions. So another key indicator for sustainability is waste. 60% of waste generated in the UK is produced by the construction sector. 32% of waste sent to landfill. That is what is accounted for by weight. And 13% of construction material are diverted straight to waste without being used. So reducing and ultimately eliminating these emissions through minimizing materials requirement, particularly those of carbon-intensive materials, and maximizing the energy efficiency of our built asset and improving the levels of reuse is going to be critical if the UK wants to meet its climate action agenda and its net zero strategy. Looking at the built environment in the UK, heritage buildings comprise approximately 20% of the UK building stock. These buildings are already considered challenging in terms of retrofit that are sensitive to the historic fabric and heritage value. If you take all of the entire building stock of the UK for 2050 in consideration, 80% of them has already been built. And so if we are to achieve our sustainability goals, we need to look at our existing buildings more carefully. Within the planning system, there are apparent disconnects and challenges with the management of heritage assets. An important problem is budgetary constraints. That makes it difficult to maintain our heritage assets, but also makes it difficult to monitor how buildings are adapted for reuse. And so in order for us to get a clear idea of how conservation and sustainability interact, we can't necessarily rely on indicators, either international indicators or national indicators. We really have to see how we value things from a financial perspective. Valuing our economy based on GDP is really not going to take us to a more sustainable planet. And so I frankly don't have any answers, but I can just highlight some of the issues I've seen when we look at international policy, national policy, and how that's implemented in real life. With that, I think I am just about made it in time, so I'm going to stop right here. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Dr. Shetabi. That was great, really informative. I know I have some questions, but I'm going to let the attendees start it off. If anyone has any questions, feel free to either place them in the Q&A portion, not the chat preferably, Or if you have any questions and you'd like to raise your hand, you can ask them directly to Dr. Shetabi. I'll give
Don't
everyone.
ask me on any dates of new policy because the policies change too quickly.
Fair enough, fair enough. I'm curious to know if any of our panelists had any questions. I know I have some, but I wanted to leave some room for you guys as well. No? All right. Well, if we don't mind, let me pull up mine. Oh wait, I think we do have one. So Sidra Hafiz asks, solar panels are energy efficient, but how can they contribute towards climate change? So I think you went into a little bit about that on both the benefits and the cons of solar panels. Could you maybe reiterate?
Since the early development of solar panels, the technology of producing solar panels has improved significantly. The earlier solar panels, return on investment in terms of money, but also in terms of power was not that great. You would begin to see a decrease in energy production after about 10 years or so. And so typically by 20 years, it was recommended that you replace them. Now, since then, there have been many advancements on what can be used as solar panel. Everything from in Italy, they have developed tiles that look like historic fabric. And so in some of the historic buildings, they can put these tiles and it will generate energy from the sun. But the other dirty little secret about solar panels is the battery you need to store this energy and then use it later. And so the production of solar panels, the production of batteries, and then discarding both of those in the environment has environmental costs in terms of production, but also in terms of waste. Some of these use toxic chemicals that really are not biodegradable and they pollute the environment. So a government policy that sort of promotes individuals or each project to put solar panels in the long term is not very environmentally friendly. It's great for the economy because now you have factories that build solar panels and you have consumers that buy it, and every 20 years they have to buy it, so they keep the economic engine going. But in terms of impact on the planet, they're not necessarily a good thing. A more environmentally friendly way is to decarbonize the grid, and so that everybody who uses energy to light or heat up their house will be using green energy. Because also solar panels then also brings up the problem of affordability. Do we only provide green energy for people who can afford it? Well, what happens to people who are on the lower ranks of affordability? Then the government has to subsidize it. And to subsidize that, where are they going to get the money? Are they going to cut it from other services, or are they going to sort of have a deal with the companies that make the solar panels? And then you have ethical issues. So it's a complex problem. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. I see, Francesco, did you also want to no, you're good. Sorry, I just saw that you could also answer it, but I see another question here. Ali Kamat asks, what are the best aspects need to be considered generally when enhancing the conservation or preservation of the building heritage values?
The best thing is to maintain it. Regular maintenance is helps with the longevity of the heritage asset And I mean, also, I have to say that we have heritage asset and we have heritage asset. We have heritage assets that are built of durable material and they built to last. But sometimes vernacular architecture or buildings that were built with non-durable material that we see in other parts of the world, it doesn't really apply to those, right? But generally, research shows that if you regularly maintain historic buildings from an energy performance perspective, they still perform pretty well. It's a lack of maintenance that makes these buildings much more difficult to deal with. And then when we want to use it for modern use or use it for a different use, we end up with sort of destroying some of the heritage fabric.
Mhm. Mhm. So using what we already have rather than building new seems to really
And
be the key.
maintain.
And
Maintenance is key.
maintaining what we have. Yeah. I have a question just because I don't see any other. The two examples that you gave us, one, it looked like it was an investor repurposing the building for social housing, and the other was a private investor. I'm curious if there are, in your opinion, at the end of a project, what ends up working out better when it comes from a heritage perspective? Because I know it sounds like a private investor likely will have the money to keep some of that heritage, but in the example that you gave, we lost the pool and the janitor's house. If it's someone developing on a social basis, it seems like there are some losses there as well when it comes to costs. So in your experience, what does better in an end project in maintaining a heritage space? Someone coming in from the private side or the public side?
Actually, the best defense comes from policy. So if you have
Okay.
very good, robust policy, then it doesn't
Mhm,
matter who is developing the site.
mhm, mhm,
But if you have weak policy, or if economically you have to make tough decisions, well, then you really can't be that difficult. So, for
mhm,
instance, in Glasgow, when right now the economic situation is a little better,
mhm,
but when I was doing this research, it was 2016, 17, 18. And Glasgow City Council was grappling with some issues, and they had too many assets. They had to pay their bills, and they needed to offload these assets. And if the developer thinks that the government is going to put too many stringent requirements on them,
mhm,
then they will be disinclined to develop the site.
mhm,
So it really depends. For instance, the first building was developed by an architect who is very passionate about heritage and very passionate about sustainability.
mhm,
So a lot of the initiatives that they put into it was actually driven by the architects themselves. Um, in the second case, the client was very demanding. And
mhm,
so the architect has to bow down to what the client wants. There's some wiggle room, but at the end of the day, the client is paying the bill. And so if the client wants something,
mhm.
you're going to have to compromise somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. All right. Well, thank you for that. If there aren't any other questions, I have one more question before we may call it quits. And it's a bit of a funny one, but if you had a magic wand, Dr. Shetabi, and you could snap your fingers and make any policy change that you could, or put any policy into effect that you think would have create big change, what would that be? If you could have your dream
My
policy.
question to you is, how do you know I don't have that wand? I'm kidding. I don't have that wand. I wish I did.
Me too.
Well, if I had a magic wand, I would change the way our economy is evaluated. I think a lot of the problems comes with how we determine economic success.
Mm.
If economic success was based on your biodiversity richness, for instance, and your cultural richness, well, then there would be a lot of incentives to make sure that our actions do not have a negative impact on either our ecology or our heritage. And the second thing is, there is this misconception that heritage stops at a particular date. Back, many years ago, of anything that was built about 50 years ago was considered as heritage. Now, buildings that were built 50 years ago are buildings of the 70s. So, which one of those do we want to save as heritage? Do we want to demolish all of them? They all have embodied carbon. But the other problem is that they weren't necessarily built to last beyond 20, 30 years.
Mm.
So my magic wand would make our building stock more durable, and the mindset that we constantly have to knock down everything and build a shiny new thing, sort of erase that mindset.
Mm. Amazing. Yeah. So very much based on a shift in values.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shetabi. Thank you for being here and imparting your knowledge on us. I know when I was going through the comment section, I saw people from Malta, Italy, Pakistan, Palestine. So we reached a huge audience today. So I want to say thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Asghari, Francesco, and all the other professors involved in the speaker series. We're having another speaker series, I believe, coming up soon. So please, anyone attending, stay tuned for that. I think Professor Asghari has some last words for us.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Shetabi, for insightful and very interesting presentations, particularly because of the case studies you went into details of the clash between, I would probably not mentioning clash, but the fact that some of the key issues that we have in this regard are realized in practice. Clash between economy and heritage, clash between economy and sustainability and so forth. And I'm glad that Nikki mentioned that very last question about that, which is, of course, has been a key problem, has been key issue, and your recommendation for changing this mindset and also evaluation measures that we use to value some of our real assets, how that may change some of the challenges that we are dealing with, and thank you for bringing that up. And with that, we also want to thank all the participants, all the panelists, and Nikki for moderating these sessions. I know it's not necessarily the best time for everyone on this series, depending on where in time zone you are, but we really appreciate you attending and presenting and moderating. And finally, I would like to also thank Dr. Atarian and Francesco for hard work on making this series ongoing. Thank you all, and we are looking forward to see you next time. I'm not sure if Francesco has the name or details of the next session, but if you have, please go ahead. Otherwise, we say goodbye to everyone. Yes, go ahead,
Thanks.
Francesco.
Yeah, I'm just sharing my screen there. Just yeah, with our next session, so it is a monthly series, as you probably know. So our next session is on October 7th. We do them the first Monday of every month, with the exception of September, since it was a holiday here. But yeah, so our regular schedule is the first Monday of every month, and so our next presentation is with Dr. Mike O'Rourke, who will be speaking on the topic, "It's not so much about what we do as it is about how we do it, and management responses to climate change impacts archaeological sites in the Northwest Territories here in Canada. So yeah, I would also just like to extend my thank you to Dr. Shetabi for the great presentation. Nikki, thank you very much for moderating today. Of course, thanks to Dr. Tani as well for his ongoing help putting on the series, and to Heritage Ottawa for being one of our sponsors, and also for the World Heritage Catalysis, who is also one of our others, our other partners in this series. So yeah, with that, one last big thank you to everybody, and of course, thank you to everyone in the audience for being here today. As always, you can find this session recorded on our YouTube channel and on our event page.
Thank you.